Why did Harold Bloom think that William Faulkner was a genius and one of the best American authors of all time? Well, today we are going to hear from Bloom, who will speak at length from three different sources I've compiled on Faulkner's greatness. And here on Right Conscious, we covered the best authors and books of all time. And of course, that includes Faulkner. So if you want more videos on Faulkner, go check out the playlist down below, and I will be adding to that list very soon. So enough from me though. Let us now hear from Bloom. Faulkner was a humanist and not a believer, though this has been obscured by neo-Christian critics. His inversions of Christian typology are frequent, and from Go Down Moses on, it seems best to characterize Faulkner, the novelist, as a natural Gnostic, though he was not immersed in the ancient heresy. He was always however, and not a literary intellectual. Gnostics necessarily are not secular humanists, like Herman Melville, who was aware of his own Gnosticism. They have a quarrel with the God of the Hebrew Bible and the Gospel of Mark. Faulkner's quarrel in Go Down Moses and afterwards was also with the God of Southern history, a God who had sanctioned slavery and its familial consequences. White patriarchs fathering children upon their black concubines was the authentic essence of Southern culture, and Faulkner's imaginative apprehension of the world that this produced is without rival. And thus begins our deep dive into Faulkner's views on Christianity, and we're about to hear more from Bloom in a second. But Faulkner is a part of a very common trend in 20th century Western literature, which is authors who've rejected the idea of Christianity as their personal religion, but have studied the Bible and Christianity deeply and decided to invert a lot of the principles and stories within it. Because as I talk about on this channel all the time, of course, most authors before the 19th century were Christian in the Western world because you had no other choice. But in the 20th and the 21st century, Christian authors are actually not statistically represented in bookshelves and on the great author lists. When we talk about, the best 100 novelists or authors of the 20th century, there are maybe 24 of those authors who would identify themselves as Christians, but the Pew Research Center, in their statistical analysis, How U.S. Religious Composition Has Changed in Recent Years, talks about how back in 1900, and Faulkner was born in 1897, and a lot of the modernist authors were born around the turn of the century, but North America was 97% Christian. And even in 2020, 72% of people identify as Christian. And so we could assume that number's probably in the mid-60s right now. But what's interesting is that when we look at that list again, and then we add people who are Christian, but then people who aren't Christian, but who've kind of used biblical imagery, language, or symbolism in their work, suddenly we're, getting much closer back to the 70s and 80s, because obviously the Bible is one of the most canonical pieces of, or is the most canonical piece of literature in the West. And that's something interesting to look at if you're an author today, or just if you're looking back at the history of 20th century literature, that a lot of these authors had the opportunity for the first time. And because artists and writers who are at a high level are usually on the cutting edge of not just art, but like of cultural thought, they broke away from Christianity, but they understood that, especially if you're writing about the South, like Cormac, McCarthy and William Faulkner did, and I could throw Toni Morrison in there, that, biblical symbolism is very potent and very important to make kind of a Southern Gothic or Southern-esque novel work. And so let us hear more now from Bloom on his kind of thoughts on Faulkner's Christianity. What matters in Major Faulkner is that the people have gone back, not to nature, but to some abyss before the creation fall. Eliot insisted that Joyce's imagination was eminently orthodox. This can be doubted, but in Faulkner's case, there is little sense in baptizing his imagination. One sees why he preferred reading the Old Testament to the New, remarking that the former was stories and the latter ideas. The remark is inadequate except insofar as it is opposed Hebraic to Hellenistic representation of character. There is little that is Homeric about the Bundrans, or Sophoclean about the Compsons. Faulkner's irony is neither classical nor romantic, neither Greek nor German. It does not say one thing while meaning another, nor trade in constants between expectation and fulfillment. Instead, it juxtaposes incommensurable realities of self and other, of parent and child, of past and future. When Gide, who won the 1947 Nobel Prize in Literature, he's a French author, maintained that Faulkner's people lacked souls, he simply failed to observe that Faulkner's ironies were biblical, to which an amendment, that was a typo. I was like, what is this word? To which an amendment must be added. In Faulkner, only the ironies are biblical. What Faulkner's people lack is the blessing. They cannot content for a time without boundaries. Yahweh will make no covenant with them. Their agon, therefore, is neither the Greek one for the foremost place, nor the Hebrew one for the blessing, which honors the father and the mother. Their agon is the hopeless one of waiting for their doom to lift. And so I think I'm saying the word right or wrong. I don't really care. Who cares? Agon in Greek is a contest, is a struggle. And so their struggle is a fruitless one, which is waiting for their doom, waiting for their misery to lift, which is very common in Faulkner novels and really a lot of Southern Gothic literature, but that there is no actual redemption. So there is a lot to unpack here. So we can first look at Faulkner's irony, which is honestly one of the better parts of his writing. So when you look at classical irony, an expectation is set up and then there is a subversion of it. But Faulkner doesn't do that. He doesn't do the classic, Achillean, like Bloom mentions here, where, Achilles' hubris leads to his downfall. And he also sometimes never really dives too deep into romantic irony, which is also very popular, which kind of contrasts this idealized world with a shattered reality. So without really spoiling anything for all you guys who haven't read any Faulkner, for instance, in his novel As I Lay Dying, the Bungerin family is on this kind of absurd, humorous journey to bury their mother. But for instance, characters who don't care or are disconnected, or one could say are psychopathic, are rewarded, and other characters who are maybe more connected and understanding are severely punished. And there is no logic to it. It doesn't make any sense. There's actually not really this big lesson that can be taught, like, oh, wow. And this is really fun, and it connects at some level, and speaking of Faulkner's genius, to his stream of consciousness writing and his fragmented narration, which help us kind of get into the same distortions of consciousness that the characters are experiencing, which makes it kind of a very fun and lively experience. And this is a tactic that really started to get, revved up right before postmodernism with people like Pynchon and John Barth and all those guys. Obviously, they took it to the next level, but people like Faulkner were kind of their predecessors in showing them the way. Obviously, Joyce also, and Proust, we could say, and Dostoevsky, yada, 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 about, getting in the head of a character who can't necessarily grasp the truth or of their situation or ground themselves in it. Another fun thing that Faulkner gets to work with in regards to irony is that he finds characters that are a part of the Southern aristocracy, and they are kind of clinging on to this vision that isn't aligned with reality. Because in the post-Civil War South, obviously things are on a kind of downward trajectory, and not just obviously things are better in a sense because slaves have been freed, but the Great Migration is happening with blacks moving to the Northeast. The whole Southern economy is a mess. Reconstruction was never really finished. And so, and it's racism, Jim Crow laws, like a bunch of crazy stuff is still happening. And so these Southern ideals of honor and tradition and the land are kind of juxtaposed between, with the decaying reality of what is actually happening during that time. And this is where irony, I think, is very powerful, because I talk about all the time on how irony has kind of ruined modern consciousness, but we kind of do cheap irony. We kind of, just do a quick setup and then do, say something ironic, quick punchlines. We all are smart enough now to be able to analyze anything. But something that is kind of sad is the loss. A lot of authors do this. This was actually a very powerful thing for authors in this modernist period, even up until the 1970s and even today, because they could look back. If you were born in 1900, then you could have a grandparent that was maybe born in the 1830s or 40s and was a part of the Civil War and really understood kind of this classic honor culture. And so then watching what the world was becoming and watching all that slip away is interesting, because there are these characters who do try to hold on to that idyllic reality. Cormac McCarthy does this with some of his Southern characters, even in his whole Border trilogy, and same with Faulkner. It's a really strong irony, because a lot of men who are kind of, who read more Faulkner than women, just statistically, and read more classic literary fiction, at least American literary fiction, than women, we love that trope, right? We love to hear about the loss of honor and all these things. Like, it really kind of churns on our souls because we're actually experiencing that right now. It's, we're in a weird situation that, when we even look back to our parents and what they are doing, we are in a totally different world with instant access to all the vices and negativities available to us online. And this kind of leads into the next point. I could drivel on about irony all day, but Bloom mentions the absence of a covenant, which means that Faulkner's characters aren't living in this kind of pagan universe or are connected to nature, but they also aren't connected to any moral or spiritual framework that gives them any meaning. They're in this gray zone that a lot of people were in, once again, at this time. And when we look at the Greek tradition of writing and even just of culture, there was this idea and this ambition that was pushing toward glory and all this stuff. And then when we look at kind of the more Hebraic traditions, there was kind of this, not a push, but there was almost a need to embody some divine or receive some divine blessing. And this is, and Faulkner takes kind of a very existential route because he is just saying that these characters are simply just waiting for their downfall without any hope of salvation, which, very much encompasses the ideals of the South during that time and even today. And this is strong because this just extends to everything. So here I am talking about plot, but this is also as true as Bloom says of characters. The Bundrins or the Compsons aren't these virtuous figures. They don't have a divine purpose. And there is no catharsis. There is no revolution. They're just living out kind of these messy situations, which once again is actually how kind of reality works. We were lied to a lot of the time by a lot of classical authors who, would write these tragedies, but they'd be just too epic. There was too much of a logical kind of follow through. But in reality, unfortunately, and it's kind of making me emotional that a lot of people's downfalls, and maybe I want you guys maybe to reflect on some people who've kind of had a bad downfall. Some of the time it's just bad luck, sometimes hubris and emotional, malignant emotional traits and qualities contribute to that, but it's just bad things just seem to happen. Just like on the other side, when you maybe reflect on some of the good things that have happened to you, it's almost absurd. You're like, I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know when I was down and out and I was 19 years old that I'd be one day, speaking to thousands of people in this video. I had gotten like multiple traumatic brain injuries from extreme sports in a couple months and was, lost in substance land and had dropped out of university and was having trouble even like reading and writing. I could barely remember anything because of how bad of a state I was in because of my concussions. And so I didn't really believe or think that any of this was possible, but there were just so many connections and beautiful things that have happened to help get me here and like give me the confidence to come out here and do this. But if I told you my whole story, none of it would make sense. And if you guys want to join the most active book club in the world, the Right Conscious Book Club is about to start reading 20 different books simultaneously. And we are not reading any William Faulkner, but we are going to be reading 6 Cormac McCarthy novels, among many other novels. And there is a book club call on every single day of the week and at different times. I guarantee you that no matter where you are in the world, that you will be able to make at least 5 different book club calls. That's why I am doing so many, because I have fans in Australia, Asia, Europe, wherever. I know you guys all work jobs like I do. And so I want to provide you guys the best experience possible. Plus, you also get access to exclusive podcasts that I'm trying to get going daily, different courses, office hours with me, which are at this moment 5 days of the week. And like I said, over 30 plus hours of content. And so if you guys want to support the channel, you can obviously go join over there, but you guys just watching my videos, commenting down below, giving me a thumbs up is more than enough. And if you guys want more information, the link to all of this is down in the description below. And let us get back to the video. And to kind of conclude our biblical section, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more. Bloom says that, quote, "Though fascinated by the Bible, Faulkner subverts it constantly, almost as if something in his genius hopes that truth can be separated out and away from the powerful stories that are the Bible's literary glory. But I will postpone this matter until I have discussed light in August." And speaking of As I Lay Dying, Bloom writes of Faulkner's masterpiece that, quote, "The uncanniness of this representation is exceeded by the Bundrins, whose plagiancy testifies to Faulkner's finest rhetorical achievement. As I Lay Dying may be the most original novel ever written by an American." And that is a huge statement right there, everybody. Maybe the most original novel ever written by an American. And I would tend to agree. I mean, I'm throwing it for sure in the top 10. Obviously, it is not free of the deepest influence Faulkner knew as a novelist. The language is never Conradian, and yet the sense of the reality principle is. But there is nothing in Conrad like Darrell Bundren, not even in The Secret Agent. As They Lay Dying is Faulkner's strongest protest against the facticity of literary convention, against the force of familial past, which tropes itself in fiction as the repetitive form of narrative imitating prior narrative. The book is a sustained nightmare insofar as it is Darrell's book, which is to say Faulkner's book or the book of his daemon. And so Bloom thinks that and would say that Faulkner is really inspired more so by Conrad than anybody else, which is a very interesting thematic choice, because then when we look kind of down the line about, of who Faulkner influences in Cormac McCarthy, who we talk about all the time on this channel. I've been to the Cormac McCarthy archive, and I've seen McCarthy write at length on Joseph Conrad, which I'll make that video sometime. And he, talks about Kurtz and other parts of Conrad's novels. And Blood Meridian is very Heart of Darkness-esque. And quick shout out, if the Blood Meridian film, which it won't, was filmed like Apocalypse Now with that same kind of Heart of Darkness feeling, then it would be maybe one of the best movies of all time. But that's not what's going to happen. And so when I hear Bloom talk about this, I think of Heidegger and Being in Time, because we hear the word uncanny thrown around all the time. It's kind of become kind of like a buzzword in literary criticism. But in Heidegger's Being in Time, it's actually kind of one of the main components. And he calls it, I think, Unheimlichkeit. And it is, and I love how, like, even in the translated, I only know that because even in the translated in Being in Times that I've read, and I've read the two main translations, like Dasein and Unheimlichkeit, like they don't even say uncanny. So anyway, when I think of Faulkner's characters and their uncanniness, Heidegger talked about how, humans are thrown into this being in the world Dasein, and it's not of their own making, obviously, and it feels strange and unsettling and yada, yada, yada. Like I said, we can go down the Heidegger rabbit hole. Maybe that'd be a great video, Faulkner and Heidegger. You know what? Screw it. We're going with Heidegger for a second. I don't even care. If you've made it this far, you'll probably enjoy this. So when we look at As I Lay Dying, once again, not really going to spoil anything here, but one of the characters is kind of moving into this existential crisis. And he has this kind of famous line, at least in my heart, at kind of I don't want to say a climax, but at a big moment, he says, "I don't know what I am." And back to Bloom, where you guys will never hear the end of me. That's another person I really want to cover on this channel. I actually have a guy who I had earlier on the show, Patrick O'Connor. He was actually the president of the Phenomenology Society, which is the big academic phenomenology group. I've had him on my show before, and he really wants to come back and talk about Heidegger, and I'm a big fan of Heidegger. And so it's also, sorry, I'm laughing now. I got to tell you guys something. It's very funny about this channel. So here I am. I'm like, we're going to talk about Heidegger. And it's like, oh shit. I'm talking about Mishima, Heidegger, Julius Evola. And it's like, guys, like, I sometimes read comments like, oh my God, you're a fascist. It's like, dude, first of all, I don't even believe in politics. If my wife decided to run for city council, I wouldn't even vote for her. I'd be like, what are you doing, bro? But I'm obviously interested in the crazy philosophies of the early 20th century because it was such an extreme time with fascism and communism and all the crazy literary theory stuff that was happening with Adorno and all them and the Frankfurt. Excuse me. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. But that's what's fun about being open-minded and not getting too bogged down in any philosophy or believing too deeply and just kind of being an explorer in knowledge, is that I can sit and talk about Julius Evola, who calls himself a super fascist, and then, make videos on Derrida. And it's like, what are you going to label me as? Like, I don't really care. I think their philosophies are fun. I think it's good to think about. I think, but then there's a whole other rabbit hole that there are people out there who aren't as kind of contemplating and playful when it comes to knowledge, and they attach on to certain things and live it out. Suddenly we have these mini Mishimas or these little mini Derridas running around university campuses, and you're like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. Anyway, back to Bloom. Faulkner writes tragic farce rather than tragedy, more in the mode of Webster, Ford, and Tourneur, than that of Shakespeare. In time, his genius or daemon may seem essentially comic, despite his dark houses and death drives. His grand family is Dickens run mad rather than Conrad run wild. The hideous saga of the Snopes, from the excessively capable Flem Snopes to the admirably named Wall Street panic Snopes. Flem, as David Minter observes, is refreshingly free of all influence anxieties. He belongs in Washington, D.C., and by now has reached there and helps to staff the White House. Alas, he by now helps to staff the universities also, if not the entire nation, as his spiritual children, the yuppies, have reached middle age. His ruined families, burdened by tradition, are Faulkner's tribute to his region. His Snopes clan is his gift to his nation. And so Bloom here is speaking about Faulkner's Snopes Trilogy, which consists of the hamlet, the town, and the mansion, I think. And so Bloom is saying that, so in the Snopes Trilogy, Faulkner basically has this family and these individuals who do terrible things, who are like very self-interested individuals and are rewarded highly and then exert a ton of influence over other people. And when we look at America today with our kind of unabashed self-interest, our consumerism, our just lack of traditional values, which I think is a net negative. Obviously, some of them we needed to move beyond, but many others we've moved beyond too fast, and now we're all kind of floating around and we're, losing our health, mental well-being, and kind of happiness. And, once again, Faulkner is kind of on the forefront of a lot of, I would say, trends in literature that are more postmodernist, because obviously when you look at late 19th century and early to mid 20th century literature, there is this this direct critique of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and these things, but it necessarily isn't very well thought out because everyone was still so tied to it. We were all so connected to it that we couldn't really take a look at it like, for instance, Thomas Pynchon does in Gravity's Rainbow. When you see how Pynchon kind of ties economic profit maximization and manipulation to psychological manipulation in Gravity's Rainbow, it's absolutely beautiful. But in the Snopes Trilogy, kind of Faulkner is at some level a predecessor to that, because Bloom mentioning the yuppies shows that kind of this generation that was born out of kind of World War II, and the people involved in World War II are focused on material success, social status, and kind of personal advancement because of kind of nuclear deterrent. But also when you look at, for instance, Adam Curtis's documentary, The Century of the Self, I mention it all the time on this channel. I highly recommend every single one of you guys go watch Century of the Self right now. It's a documentary that shows how, and Adam Curtis is a great documentary maker. It's free on YouTube. He shows how Freud's teachings were utilized by the Nazis, the Russians, and the Americans as a means of propaganda, and how kind of all that led to the Second World War. But then more so than that, how once they kind of saw how that kind of went wrong, and with nuclear deterrence, how they kind of shifted all that to kind of profit maximization, especially in the West. They kind of said, okay, like that was kind of a, MK Ultra, all these things are kind of bad. And that's kind of one of the themes, once again, of Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, is that we've now have this kind of open front, this zone. We're in the zone of this new world where we get to create out of the destruction this new utopia that rewards the yuppies. And this kind of contrast, as Bloom says, kind of Dickens' wild characters, and that's why he says Faulkner gone wild, because Dickens does have moments where characters are kind of slipping, but they always are contained by this moral narrative arc that kind of critiques the inequities of the world. And, like I said, it's just that classic kind of Industrial Revolution era type writing. And these characters, unlike maybe some of the ones we were just talking about in like As I Lay Dying or The Sound and the Fury, the Snopes characters are not burdened like Conrad's characters by kind of these moral crises. They are not like Kurtz out there who are contemplating these things. And much like the yuppies and people who run social media companies and work for weapons companies and whatnot, they have this kind of ability to have no moral conscience about anything. And I think they sleep great at night. Like I've personally met some of them. I live in a town where, there's a ton of people who work for Raytheon, and I have personally seen no existential doubt from anyone who works in the military, for Raytheon, on the Border Patrol. So this is why William Faulkner is a genius. He understands how to combine irony and tie it to these new cultural kind of trends that he sees going forward. I attribute this to Cormac McCarthy also. When I look at Cormac McCarthy's vision of what the West was going to become when he was writing screenplays like No Country for Old Men and the Border Trilogy back in the 1970s, spot on. When I look at what his prediction of necrophiliacs like Ted Bundy and other crazies with his third novel, Child of God, which was a decade before any of that was, had started to happen. Spot on again. Once again, artists and thinkers are at the forefront of consciousness, at the forefront of these things. And I'm sure a lot of you guys, that's what's crazy. Like, a lot of you guys know where things are going to happen. Like, if I asked you right now, hey, what's going to happen 20 years from now? A lot of you guys could tell me, but no one believes you. Nobody cares. Everyone's trying to act like that's not the case and, get profit maximalization or focus on short-term wins to stay in elected positions or whatever. And instead of actually saying like, hey, all this crazy technology usage, all this kind of freedom that we're giving teenagers to express themselves in sometimes ways that are irreversible, whether that's physical, mental, or spiritual. Like, I've experienced that. I'm sure you guys have. Like, I look back at some of my life and what I was kind of pushed into because of modern culture and media, and I did things or experienced things that I necessarily didn't need to experience, especially in kind of this utopian and calm society. Now I'm almost forever morally corrupted and existentially in dread because of those past experiences. And so that is only going to get worse. Even more so because people are going to be living in their heads, living inside their phones. And if you aren't exposed to the world, if you don't escape the simulacrum and go back to the original source, which is nature or God or whatever, and connect with that and connect with other humans on a social basis, whether that's through friendship or romantic relationships, then the mind is a very dark place to be alone for a lot of people. We idolize these artists who, were alone in the mind, but most of the time they lived very hard lives. And we idolize them because they produce great art. But what about the other people, everybody else? I'm sure billions by now of people in history who weren't artists, who didn't write anything down, who had to live inside their head and had a terrible time of it. And, we're doubling down on that in terms of culture now. And so this is why Faulkner is a genius, because he saw the trend toward this. He saw the trend toward profit maximalization and us moving away from these values. And now I'm just kind of discussing what's later on down the path. Faulkner's obviously, and Bloom doesn't really talk about this, a very beautiful writer. Like, for instance, like, I really like his short story, The Bear. Like, I think that has probably the most stylistic influence on a Cormac McCarthy or a lot of other authors. Like, when Faulkner is on and he's, I don't want to say maximalist, but there's some novels or some passages where it's just simple Southern novel and nothing stylistically is crazy. But when Faulkner wants to do it, he really is very beautiful as a writer. And maybe it's just kind of an American bias, or I just understand American authors a little bit more, but I'm very connected to it. I'm very excited to make more videos on William Faulkner. I'm glad I kind of could kick this off with kind of a good video where I can brain dump some of the emotions and thoughts I have on Faulkner, and there's plenty more. But like all the other authors I'm covering on the channel, my goal is to make at least 200 videos on all of them to kind of create a library of content, because I remember when I got into William Faulkner, when I was high school, before even the traumatic brain injuries I was talking about, there was nothing. I read some of his works. I was confused. I wasn't able to talk to anyone. My high school English teachers were fucking idiots. Like, they didn't read. They were just there to get a paycheck and move toward retirement. And that's why I actually created this channel. I want someone who is new, who doesn't have anybody, not just to have one video or have a video essay on Faulkner, but just have an endless playlist of videos to watch and experience, while they can't read, while they're at work or cleaning the house or riding their bike or whatever, because that's what I personally do. That's what I've done, mostly because the literature scene is kind of scant. Like, it's crazy. There's actually not very many audiobooks or biographies of authors available, like on Audible or really anywhere. It's actually very hard to learn. Like, if I said, the market of history podcasts and history audiobooks, is like profound. It's endless. But in terms of like literary analysis and thinking about literature, it's actually very small. And so that's what I'm trying to create here. I love every single one of you guys, and I will see you guys in another Faulkner video or another video on a great author very soon.